Hi, my name is Sarah Stokes, and my major is International Studies and Russian Studies. Today, I will be presenting to you about bilingualism and language development. Despite the fact that much of the world is bilingual, the prevailing question of bilingual development centers around setbacks of bilingualism as compared to monolingual development. Thus, though bilingualism might actually be the global norm, monolingual language development has been the primary focus of study and has cast a powerful shadow over research into bilingualism. Most research on bilingual development begins by asking the question of how far off bilingual kids are developmentally from monolingual kids, which demonstrates this presumption of a monolingual standard. There are many approaches to language learning. The most common approach is probably the cognitive development approach, which is very child-centric and looks at brain responses and registered reactions, looking for interference in language learning. But another approach is social development, looking at the family as a whole and processes of observation and imitation, and might take into account parent educations or parent-child exposure. A final model of development could be the bioecological approach, which might look at the nested context that a child is situated within and the cultural processes that might affect language learning. The main concern of bilingualism is that of language interference. Language interference can be defined as predictable errors stemming from language structures in the speaker's first language while they are using their second language. For example, a child may reach for a word in English, and instead, the concept first comes to them in Spanish. Maria Sebastian Gaius wrote an article on bilingualism called Bilingual Language Acquisition, in which she examined the common understandings of bilingualism as detrimental to language development. She notes that in most societies, bilingualism is associated with immigration and with low socioeconomic status. So bilingualism is generally considered harmful from the very beginning. She pinpoints the premise of objections to bilingual language learning by saying that the implicit assumption here is that in changing from 1 to 2 languages, a big difference is made in how the brain deals with linguistic input. So let's take a look at language development to see if this is actually the case. Sebastian Gaius notes that in previous studies, infants are able to distinguish between different language patterns shortly after birth. These studies make use of familiarization methods in which infants are taught to turn their head to elicit a verbal stimulus. At first, they are habituated to one of the language categories, such as French, and then in the test phase, they are introduced to a new language category, maybe Russian. This analysis determined whether infants can distinguish between the two language sets. This capacity typically develops around 4.5 months for infants in both monolingual and bilingual environments, meaning that there is no developmental difference in this area. Interestingly, monolingual infants show a preference for language spoken by their mother during pregnancy, but bilinguals do not. Some arguments have been made that bilingual infants' lack of language preference will inhibit their ability to distinguish between languages. This, however, is not true. Bilinguals show equal ability to distinguish between languages and may even demonstrate a better reorientation to a third, unfamiliar language. Next, studies of bilingual infants' ability to discern phoneme differences is inconclusive at the moment. A phoneme is the smallest unit of acceptable sound particular to a language. It can be thought of as an atom of speech. Different languages have different phonemes, which are sometimes hard to detect and produce unless you are a native speaker. For example, Russian has 2 letters, sh and sha, and it is very hard for English speakers to distinguish the difference between them. Whether monolinguals and bilinguals display any developmental differences in this area is unclear. Studies of Spanish and Catalan phonemes suggest delay, but studies of French and English phonemes do not. Other areas of language development include word recognition and object labeling. In word recognition, bilingual infants match the development of monolingual infants, and they do not exhibit any delay in distinguishing between real words and gibberish. In toddlerhood, mispronunciation tends to bother bilingual kids less than monolingual toddlers. In object labeling tasks, a monolingual infant will typically show surprise if an object is called by a grammatically incorrect label at around 14 months. By 17 months, they will show surprise if pronunciation of the label is off by a single phoneme. This second capacity does not develop for bilingual infants until around 20 months. However, some argue that this may be an adaptive strategy for bilinguals and demonstrate their capacity to hold both language systems in mind. So a quick review of the developmental timeline shows that monolingual infants develop a language preference in the womb, while bilinguals do not. And then around 4.5 months, both babies can discriminate between languages. At 14 months, they will show surprise at improper labels applied to familiar objects. Between 17 and 20 months, babies register surprise at even slight mispronunciations of familiar labels. So what are some conclusions we can draw? First, bilingual infants are not developmentally delayed and tend to be on par with monolingual development. Second, bilingual children develop different language learning strategies in toddlerhood. These strategies tend to be less heuristic-based than monolinguals, meaning that they are less likely to resolve ambiguity in labels. There are two important implications. First, bilingualism will present some advantages in certain tasks, such as executive function, but it might present disadvantages in others, such as proper pronunciation. The most important conclusion to draw is that we need to be more careful with our research models. Just because bilingual development does not perfectly mirror monolingual development does not mean that bilinguals have fallen behind. This is an unfortunate frame that has persisted far too long in the psychological community. Discrepancies in bilingual development can sometimes mean that the task assigned is not measuring what is intended to measure for bilingual children. But finally, there is a real lack of research into bilingualism, and most studies still focus on monolingual language development. The big takeaway for me in researching this issue was how the framework of monolingual development impedes effective education policy. For example, I came across a 2012 article that looked at the one parent, one language approach to raising bilingual children. This method used to be the recommended approach to raising bilingual children. The assumption was that the language systems should be kept as distinct as possible so that the child does not get confused. So, for example, the mom would speak in only Russian to her child, while the dad would speak in only English to the child. This study, however, found that this method was not effective and resulted in imbalanced language acquisition, which just goes to show how much more research needs to be put into bilingual development and the best practices for bilingual parenting. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope you learned something new.